მინდა გაგაცნოთ ეს კლუბი, რომელიც შექმნეს ახალგაზრდებმა, სხვადასხვა დაერქვა ახალგაზრდებმა, Club of Liberty და რომლებიც ამ ფაქტობრივად ამ ლექციით ხსნიან თავიანთ საქმიანობას. ხო, საბლედნე შანსებს გავაკეთებ. და გადავცემ სრულიად ხოლმე.
ინგლისურად დავიწყე. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming and attending this lecture. This is the first lecture organized by Club of Liberty with support of Free University. And well, our club's aim is to introduce liberal ideas to the society and improve the level of liberal education. Every week we will organize lectures about different global and actual issues concerning Georgia. And now let's switch to the main part of this evening. Well, I want to introduce you Professor Robert Lawson. And it's very significant for us that the first public lecture will be given by such a well-known economic and financial expert in the world, Mr. Robert Lawson. He is the director of International Finance and Global Competition Center in Auburn University. He is also founder of the World Economic Freedom World Project. Mr. Robert's articles are published in famous magazines like Public Choice, Cato Journal, and so on. The subject of this lesson will be economic freedom and economic growth. Let's start. Thank you.
I just want to add that liberal means a different thing in the United States of America. So Robert is not liberal. In American sense, he's libertarian.
Yes, thank you.
American liberals. I made the same mistake. When I first time, not first time, I came to America and I go to Cato Institute. I say, I'm a liberal. And they're looking to me such a crazy person. Why you come to Cato Institute? You're a liberal.
Yes, in America, liberal means the exact opposite of liberal.
Yeah.
No, I use liberal in the proper sense, not the corrupt American. So, well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, I've been here for 1 week and I've been lecturing to students and some professors. I think this is the 17th lecture I'm giving this week. This is the last one, and I'm looking forward to going home. And tomorrow, after I fly home, I will be in Disneyland, so in Florida. So it'll be nice and warm, about, I don't know, maybe 30 degrees Celsius. So it'll be a nice break for this. I'm going to talk about economic freedom and economic growth. And I think some of you in the students, what is the name? Club of Liberty may have seen me talk last year. I was here in May last, and I talked about the economic freedom of the world project itself. Today I'm going to talk about economic growth, but in the process of doing so, I will also talk about the economic freedom project. Very happy to see a Club for Liberty here. I do give talks in the United States. There's a group in the United States called Students for Liberty, and they have chapters, groups all across different campuses. And one of the best groups is at George Mason University. George Mason University is in Washington, D.C., and it's a very liberal university in the proper sense of the word. And the student who runs the Students for Liberty is actually a Georgian girl. And so we've talked about Georgia too. So I think she was born in the United States, but her parents were born here. So onward we go, economic freedom and growth. And indeed, economic growth is probably the oldest topic in economics. Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. The title of the book was Wealth of Nations. He wanted to know why and how countries got rich, and why some countries were rich and other countries were not rich. And to get rich requires you to grow. We all start poor, so rich countries used to be poor. The United States used to be poor. England used to be poor. So they got rich because they grew. They grew. And so the real question in economics about why some countries are rich and why some other countries are poor is, well, why did some countries grow and other countries not grow? And that's the question that I want to try to talk with you today about. Yes. Some of my slides are going to look really complicated, but trust me, they are not. It's very easy stuff. Okay? This one looks easy, I think. There's three basic theories out there. In modern day, modern economists, the modern economists who study growth, they usually start with what we call the neoclassical growth model. That's the 20th century growth model. That's the growth model that the 20th century people came up with. A fellow named Solow, Robert Solow, is the guy I would think of first there. He was a professor at Harvard University. He won the Nobel Prize. He's very well known. And he came up with what we call the Solow growth model. Now, the Solow growth model imagines or acts like the whole economy is like a big factory. So if we were running a factory, like a shoe factory, how do we make shoes? Well, we get leather and rubber and other things, and we put them in the factory. And then we need workers to put the shoes together, so we hire some workers. We bring in some machines maybe to help. So we put all these inputs in. We put in resources, raw materials, capital machinery, people. We put them into the factory, and we make shoes. Okay, that's easy. Well, if we double the number of rubber and the amount of leather, and we double the number of workers and double the number of machines, what happens? We make more shoes. The more inputs into the factory, the more shoes come out of the factory. It's just logic, yes? I mean, it's pretty logic. I don't know if we double the number of shoes, but we'll get more shoes. Okay? So the Solow growth model is about an economy. The economy of Georgia, the economy of Russia, the economy of the United States. And it says, well, what if it was like a factory? Well, if it was like a factory, then what matters is inputs. If you have a lot of inputs, you have a lot of output. You'll have a lot of production. Okay. Now, as far as growth is concerned, growth is the change in output. How many shoes did we make last year in the factory versus how many we make this year in the factory? Well, if how many shoes we make is about inputs, change in the number of shoes is going to be about change in the inputs. If we put in more leather and more workers and more technology and more machines, we'll get more. So for Solow and for standard economists, regular economists like me, I'm a regular economist, I teach this to my students, growth is about changes in inputs. It's about getting more resources, getting more people, and very importantly, getting more technology. Technology is, to economists, technology just means knowledge. Because the most important resource is knowledge. About how do we put leather and shoes, how do we put leather and people together and make more shoes. So real economies grow because of growth in inputs and growth in technology. And it's the metaphor, the comparison that Solow used really was just like we teach about factories. Okay, so it's the factory metaphor, factory analogy. Okay, that's one theory. So some countries grow and become rich because they've got lots of inputs and they've developed lots of technology. There's one problem though. There are a lot of countries in the world that seem to have a lot of resources that don't produce a lot. There's Russia. Russia has lots of resources, oil and farmland and all this great stuff. And Russia isn't very rich. There's Argentina in South America, very, very resource-rich country. And they're very poor. And then, on the other hand, there's Hong Kong. Hong Kong has no resources, zero farmland, right? Zero oil, zero water. They have no fresh water in Hong Kong. 100% of all the water in Hong Kong is imported every day from China. And it's just across the river or the harbor, but they have no fresh water. And yet Hong Kong today is one of the richest places in the world. So the solo model of why some countries are prosperous, maybe it's right, but it's got some problems. There are a lot of problems. There are a lot of places on earth where it doesn't look like that's exactly working. Resources alone, inputs alone do not seem to give us growth and prosperity. Okay, so that's the first theory. Second theory is, well, maybe some countries are just lucky to be not in the tropics. There's a guy named Jeffrey Sachs. He's a professor at Columbia University in New York. And Jeff Sachs says that if you're in the tropics, that's not good for your growth because it's hot there. And, no one wants to work when it's hot, right? And when it's cold, you have to work to stay warm, right? And hot places have mosquitoes. And mosquitoes carry disease, and people get sick, and people who are sick don't work hard. And so the whole argument, and it's more complicated than that, but Jeff Sachs argues that tropical location is bad for growth. And he also argues that being close to the coastline is good. If your country is landlocked, like Kazakhstan or something, and you're very, very far away from oceans, that's bad because it's hard to trade with people over land. Land travel is very expensive. Ocean travel is very, very cheap. It's like 100 times cheaper to travel over the ocean like goods and services versus the land. So countries that are located outside of the tropics where it's not too hot and there aren't very many mosquitoes, and countries that are near coastlines, these guys, Jeffrey Sachs and another guy, Jared Diamond, they say that these countries should grow more quickly and become more prosperous. And this is generally true, yeah? I mean, countries in the northern part of the world, Norway, and they're pretty rich, and Canada, pretty rich, and in the very, very south, Australia, New Zealand, even South Africa, that's in the places in the middle, are the poor places. It looks like it might be a good theory, okay? But there are problems here. There are countries in the far north that aren't as rich. Russia is kind of cold, and they're not very rich. And Argentina is also, lots of Argentina is in the nice temperate, and it's not very rich. Okay, so it might work, but there are problems. Okay, so that's the second theory: is geographical location and the attributes of your country's geography matter. But the oldest theory, the original theory about why some countries are rich, comes from Adam Smith. Adam Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations that the reason countries grow and become rich is because they have good institutions. In his language, Smith called it a system of natural liberty. Smith said when countries pursue a system of natural liberty, they grow and prosper. And if you want to become more growth and more prosperous, you should add more liberty. And by natural liberty, he meant what we would today, or at least I would today, call economic freedom. Different terms, different eras, same thing. Laissez-faire, free market, natural liberty, economic freedom, all these things basically mean the same thing. It means private property, free trade, open trade, few regulations, low taxes, not necessarily zero taxes, but low taxes, good administration of justice, fair courts, basic things like this. Smith argued in 1776 that that's what you need for growth. Now, in modern era, we have guys like Douglas North and, of course, Milton Friedman, and maybe Bob Lawson. I don't think I'm in their league. Those guys won Nobel Prizes. And I'm not going to win a Nobel Prize, but they're these guys. Okay. Now, so we have these different views of why countries prosper. Some economists, like Solow, say countries prosper because they just get lots of inputs and technology. And then some economists say countries grow and prosper because they're just lucky to be in warm or cold places with no mosquitoes, close to an ocean. And then we have economists like North and Friedman and me who say, well, some countries prosper because they've got good human institutions like private property and low taxes and regulations and things like that. Now, there is no reason all three of these views might be right. In other words, Solow might be right in that inputs matter. Investment in technology and investment in capital and inputs, it might matter. Sachs might be right, that being in the tropics is kind of bad, and maybe being in the coastline is good. And Friedman and North and Lawson might be right that institutions matter. So all three of these views can all three be right at the same time. So if I'm right, that doesn't mean I'm saying Jeffrey Sachs is wrong or Robert Solow is wrong. Okay? And so what we want to try to do today is I want to try to walk you through an exercise about how a scholar like me in my office at Auburn University, how we go about trying to study these various theories of economic growth and trying to figure out, who's right or who's wrong, or are we all three right? That's the kind of question that we want to try to pursue. Okay, that looks complicated. It's not. It's really not. Okay, it's just an equation, right? My American students aren't very good, so they'd be freaking out by now. They're, oh my gosh, I don't know what that means. But you are all smart Georgian students, so G stands for growth. Okay, that's how fast you're growing. And in terms of measurement, I measure this as the annual rate of growth in GDP per capita over. This is the numbers we'll be showing you are for a long period of time. I think it's a 20-year growth period of time, 1980 to 2000. Okay, so G is growth, and then we have an equation. The equation will include GDP at the beginning of the period, your level at the beginning of the period. So one of the things that we get from the Solow growth model, from the Robert Solow's mathematical model, one of the implications is that if you're very poor today, you'll grow quick in the future. If you're very rich today, you'll grow less quick in the future. And the two countries will converge together. Okay? So when people study economic growth and they're interested in the Solow neoclassical growth model, they always want to know, where did you start? Because if you start very low, you should catch up, or what they call converge. You should converge, get closer to the higher income countries. Okay? So that's what that's for. And then the other two are just investment. Investment in capital, that's K. Okay, that's Karl Marx's only contribution to modern economics, right? Is that we use the letter K. It's the only thing we still have from Marx. And the rest was worthless, but we use the letter K. And then INVH is the investment in human capital. And we can measure how much capital gets bigger in a year, and how much human capital, which is basically measured by education and life expectancy, how much people get bigger. Okay, not you, but how many more people we have. Okay, so that's Solow. Solow's model says countries that start poor should grow quickly. Countries that invest more should grow more quickly. Okay, and that we would start with that. And I won't show you any real numbers, but if you run the numbers in what we call a regression, if you run the numbers, that model gets about 30% right. That's, if you look at all the growth in the world, some are high, some are low, some are middle. If you look at all the countries growing in the world, about 30% of the ups and downs in growth we get with this simple model. The model is 30% right, I guess. Okay? Well, let's go ahead and add in some more variables. Let's add in Jeffrey Sachs's geography variables. Now, we have two of them. We actually are using the exact ones that Jeff Sachs himself uses in his studies, so I didn't invent these, I just borrowed them from him. One is the tropics, and I think it's measured as the percentage of the country that is in the tropics, in between the two tropics. Now, for most countries, it's either 0% or 1, because you're out above or below, or in. But there are some countries like Brazil where some of the country is in it and some of it's not. So so it's a proportion for some. And then the other one is coast. It's the share of the population that's within 60 kilometers, I think, or maybe it's 100 kilometers, 60 miles of the coastline. So for Georgia, that I don't know what proportion that would be, but people in Batumi and Poti would be in that, but Tbilisi not. So I don't know, maybe what, 10% of the Georgian population, 15, 20, whatever, some number. So that would be what that variable measures, how close your population is to the coast. And the closer you are to the coast, it should be the better for growth. Okay. All right, well, if you include these additional geographic variables, the model gets a little bit better. A little bit better. We go from 30 to 40. Okay, it's not that bad, actually. It's not bad. Right? It's not great, but it's not bad. So the last step is to try to add in some institutional variables, EF and change in EF. EF stands for economic freedom. And there's this thing called an economic freedom index out there that I produce, and that's why they invited me to come here. And over there on the map, there you see different colors. The countries that are blue are countries that have very high ratings on economic freedom. That means they've got a lot of private property, relatively low taxes, they're open for trade. Countries that are green are sort of the next group, yellow the next, and red, that's the bad places. That's high taxes, bad private property, lots of regulations, things like that. So we have this index that measures how close you are to free markets. Now, no country's perfect, so nobody gets a perfect score. Hong Kong is number one, but no one gets a perfect score. And then we have at the bottom of that list Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is the lowest country on our list. Okay, we don't have North Korea, so we don't have data for that. Okay, so so in terms of the model that we're trying to build for economic growth, we're going to add in a measure of where is your economic freedom level. Now, the Economic Freedom Index is measured on a 10-point scale from 0 to 10. Most countries are really between 3 and 9. All right? So that's the scale. And so the EF is where is your level? Okay? And then change in EF is delta EF. That is the change. So where did you start versus where were you at the end of the period? So in 1980, if you were a 4, and then in 2000 you were a 6, you changed by 2 points. So that's what that variable is. So in terms of institutions, we're trying to capture both how good is your institution in general, but also are you a reformer? Now, Georgia, of course, I don't actually think I have numbers for Georgia in 1980 when you were still in the Soviet Union. But of course, Georgia's level of economic freedom in 1980 was what?
Very bad.
Very bad. I mean, as red, very, very bad. Okay. And now today,
it's about North Korea.
Yeah, North Korea, yeah. And today it's really high. So the EF number for Georgia would be very low, but the change in EF would be very high. China is another example. China would have a low level, but a high change because they've had huge reforms. And then you have like Hong Kong. What about Hong Kong? They've always been high, so they have a high EF, but their change is very low because they really haven't changed. I mean, they're already at the top. There's nowhere to go. That's it. Okay. So we have both kinds of variables: so where you are, and also are you moving? Okay. And we want to try to measure that. Now you see, if you do this, if you add these two variables to the model, the overall fit, the overall model goes up to an R squared, as we call it, about 60%. And that's about as high as you can get in any growth regression, any growth study. If you use different variables and things, about 0.6 is as high as any of them go. Okay. Now, there are a lot of choices that a scholar like myself makes when I do a study like the one I'm describing. The study I'm describing actually is one that I published. There are a lot of choices, like do I do 1980 to 2000 or 1990 to 2005, or do I do high-income countries only, or do I include low-income countries? Do I use the INVH, the Human Capital Investment number? There's one that a guy named Barrow did, but then there's another measure by a guy named Dwyer. And which one do you use? So the point is, when real scholars are studying economic growth, there are many, many choices the scholar has to make about what time period do you study, which countries do you study, exactly which variables do you include, and you just can't do it all. You can't include everything. You can't do every version. So I have my favorites, and I'm showing you my favorites. I'll talk a little bit later about other people who have done different versions of growth studies and where we agree and disagree. But this is sort of my favorite way of studying economic growth, but it's pretty standard. Okay? Now, I'm interested in, again, it's really not that complicated, but if you run that last model, if you collect the data for, I think, about 100 countries, from 1980 to 2000, 2005, I think, you get results that I can summarize here. B is the coefficient that goes with GDP 0, and it's negative. That's what it should be. Countries that are rich today grow less rapidly than countries that are poor. Countries that are poor grow more quickly. That's exactly what Robert Solow said should happen. And that's what he called convergence. Bob Solow was right. By the way, I don't like the guy. I mean, he's kind of he's an American liberal, all right? He's not a Georgian liberal, he's an American liberal, which is, he's a socialist. But he was right about the fact that if you look at the data, and his model predicts that countries that are poor should grow more quickly. That's right. Same thing with C and D. C and D are the coefficients that go with his investment, and they're positive, especially the investment in K, capital, human, physical capital. Boy, that is, every regression anyone's ever run, any study of economic growth that's ever been done shows that if you invest more in capital, your country grows more quickly. Right? Higher levels of investment yield higher levels of growth. All right? Especially when you have other things controlled for. The human capital measure, D, is positive, but it's actually kind of weird. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It depends on which measure you use, which countries, which time period. There's not a lot of agreement among growth scholars as to whether or not human capital, as a people, matter that much in terms of growth. I mean, a lot of people think if you get an education, if everybody in Georgia gets an education, Georgia will grow faster. Well, the evidence doesn't really say that. The evidence says maybe it's positive, but it's not very big, and sometimes we can't find it at all. Depends on the study you look at. So education in people, investment in people, is probably positive, but it's probably small, and might not be there at all, I'm not sure. But investment in capital, 100% sure, positive, big, certainly there. Capital investment, gross capital formation in the data is very strong. Solow was right, I think, about that. Now, going on, looking at the tropic and coast variable, this is Jeff Sachs' variables. Yeah, it looks like E works. Yeah, it looks like countries, E is negative. If you're in the tropics, yep, they don't grow as fast. Yeah, it's hot. I guess I don't know. It's just people are tired and sick in the tropics a lot, and it's not good for growth. It's a pretty consistent result, not just in the work that I do, Jeffrey Sachs, other people who look at this. It does work. There's not a heck of a lot you can do about it. I mean, you can't move your country, but it does seem to be a factor that matters. We don't usually find the coastline variable works, so F is usually 0 for us. Again, some people find it, we don't usually find it. But the variable I really care about is G and H, because I wrote the Economic Freedom Index. I'm trying to see, does the institutional measure of economic freedom, does that affect growth? And the good news is it sure does. G is about 1 point. Now let me try to get you to think about what 1.0 means. So the index is about the index range over here. You can come up and look at the map maybe later. The index, Zimbabwe is about a 3. Hong Kong is about a 9. Okay? So the G coefficient, a 1 coefficient, says that if you are if you're a 6, where's the 6? 6 is right here. If you're a 6, compared to a 7, 7's right here, that's about 1 percentage point per year in more economic growth. Countries with 7s, according to the regression, countries with a 7 will grow about 1 percentage point per year faster than a country that has a 6. That's a big deal. 1% a year for 20 years is a big deal. Right? If you compound 1 percentage point 20 times, you get a big difference after 20 years. So that's a pretty big number. So if you're down here, right here, if you're sort of on the yellow-red range, and you become on the sort of the high green range, that's kind of like Georgia. Georgia was red, and now you're actually a little bit up here. That's probably worth a point per year of economic growth. Maybe more than a point for Georgia. That's a big deal. Okay? The second one is actually 8, is the change. Actually, that's more of the Georgia case. The change is, where were you at the beginning compared to where were you at the end? If you were a 6 at the beginning and ended up with a 7, you're going to have another 3/4 of a point, 0.75. Okay? That's pretty big too. And Georgia, I don't know, I don't have the data for Georgia, but Georgia probably came up 5, 6 points on our index. They went from a 3 to a
We were very low. We were somewhere here,
Yeah.
6 years ago.
6 years ago you were in the yellows, and now you're in the blue. He's come up about 2 or 3 points. Okay. So what I would argue is that according to the data we have, economic freedom really matters. If you've got good quality institutions defined by this index, you're going to grow more rapidly than if you have less. And if you reform, if you change, if you get better, you're going to have more economic freedom. You're going to have more growth. And the numbers are not small. They're really quite meaningfully large numbers. Okay? Again, this comes from a study that I did with Randy Holcomb and Jim Courtney, 2 of my former professors. So that's the sort of standard way in which we study economic growth. And again, other professors, other universities, other scholars, other papers, they're all a little bit different. There are some results that are pretty consistent, though. One of them is that investment always seems to matter. The investment in capital, INVK, that variable, no matter how you do your study, or which countries you include, or what years you use, INVK, investment in capital, always works. And there are now dozens of studies that use the Economic Freedom Index. And 100% of them, with no exceptions, say the same thing I just told you. The number won't always be exactly the same. It might be 0.9 instead of 1 or a little higher. But all of them say economic freedom, countries with more economic freedom and countries with growing economic freedom, they're growing more rapidly than countries that have less. All right. Now, there is a little technical thing that I think I should mention. Investment in capital is strongly positive for growth. But, you know, economic freedom, and whether you have a market economy and private property and low taxes and low regulations, that also determines how much investment you have. So the paper that I'm using as the basis for this talk, that paper goes through an initial, one more exercise. This is, well, economic freedom affects growth directly. It just makes everything work better. People have stronger incentives to work harder. They feel more secure in their property, so they can invest more. And that's the indirect channel. The indirect channel is, it's not just that we're working harder, it's that we're also investing more. So there's 2 ways economic freedom might make us grow more quickly. Just by making everything work better, but also because it gives us an incentive to invest more. And remember, investment always is positive. Okay? So there's a direct way and an indirect way. We have a fancy way in the paper, econometrics, it's statistics. We have a fancy way of estimating how much this indirect effect is. And so if you combine the direct and the indirect, the numbers, instead of being 1, it goes up to 1.5. And instead of being 0.75, it goes up to 1.3. Much bigger, right? These are big numbers. These are really big numbers. A large portion of the variation in growth across the world is reflecting the differences in human institutions. And countries that have more markets and who are reforming towards markets are in fact growing more rapidly. And it's not a small effect on growth, it's a big effect on growth. And it's really very obvious in the data. And you don't have to take it from me. You can read this guy, Jacob de Haan. Jacob de Haan is a Dutch economist. He's a social democrat. He's not a liberal. All right, and we're kind of not even friends. Okay, we shake hands when we meet, but I don't think he likes me. And I'm not sure I like him. Okay. And he's been studying economic growth too. And he has his favorite way of doing things, and I have my favorite way of doing things. And a couple years ago, he wrote a study where he looked at all the studies out there that had used economic freedom to study growth. There are like 24 of them now. It's like 25 papers published in different journals, different people. He looked at all the studies out there, and he concluded the last line. It is clear from these studies that economic freedom seems to have a positive association with growth. None of the studies that he could find, literally zero of the countries, or the studies, does he find that economic freedom is bad for growth. So it's not just my word. It's not just Bob Lawson, the guy that created the Economic Freedom Index, who cheated and found the one way of doing it that makes it work. The 24 other people that did studies, completely different ways from the way in which I do my studies, they all have the same result. Economic freedom is positive for growth. And not a single scholar has published a study, to our knowledge, has published a study that says economic freedom is bad for growth. Exactly zero. Right? That makes me feel good. But it makes me feel good, especially good because Jacob is not a liberal. He's not a friend. He's just a scholar doing good work in Holland, and he and I actually have disagreements. In fact, we disagree. If you remember the equation, you see the equation there that I run? You see the last term, the change in economic freedom? Jacob wrote a paper, and he says, you should include change, but you shouldn't include EF, the level. He said you shouldn't include it. Okay, it's his view. I think he's crazy. I don't see why you can't include it. But he said, don't include EF. He said, you're wrong if you include EF. You should do it with just change in EF. Okay, that's his view. So he argued that it's not appropriate to include level and change. You should only include change. I wrote an article that said he was wrong. He and a friend wrote an article that said no, that I was wrong. I wrote another article that said he was wrong. And he and his friend wrote yet another article saying I was wrong. And at the end of the day, the only thing you need to know is that I'm right and they're wrong. But no, in all seriousness, I'm joking a little bit. There are a lot of ways to do statistical studies. And you see scholars doing statistical studies, and it's very confusing to regular people. Because somebody says a study that says this, and then someone does another study that says that, and they don't agree, and then someone does another study and it's different. And a lot of normal people come away with the view that statistics is all a bunch of crap. Just people making numbers up, and they're liars, and if you work hard enough, you can make the data say anything you want. Well, you know what? That's not true. There are dishonest scholars out there. There are people who are dishonest with the data. And they lie. But most of us are not. Most of us are just honest scholars trying to collect data, trying to answer big questions like why do some countries grow more quickly and other countries grow less quickly? We are limited because we don't have enough, we don't have all the countries we'd like, we don't have all the data, the measurements we have aren't as good as we'd like. We have all these limitations. We each make different choices about how we approach it. And sometimes we don't agree, but the general public doesn't understand. Most of the time, there's a lot of agreement. And in the economic growth literature, there's a lot of agreement now that investment matters and institutions matter. And they matter a lot. This is not just liberal ideology. All right? There's no liberal ideology here. This is just the way that the patterns of growth and the data that we have. Okay? So I think it's important to don't be too cynical about data. Data, yeah, it's complicated. Working with data is hard, and it's sometimes that we don't exactly know how to get the answers from the data that we're looking for. But there are a lot of areas where data really have helped us understand the world better. And slowly but surely, in the last 20 years, economic growth patterns around the world are becoming easier to understand because we've been studying with these data. Right. If you'll allow me to change gears a little bit, I'd like to finish up the talk by talking about some non-economic growth topics. Lasha, wherever he is, he asked me to speak about growth, and Claude wanted me to talk about growth, but I also want to talk about other things. There's a lot of neat research that's being done with the Economic Freedom Index about other things besides growth. Now, most of my stuff has been about growth and why countries grow fast and not. But there are some other good studies out there. I wanted to draw your attention to them, and if you're interested in any of these topics, I'd be happy to try to provide you with a complete citation if you want to look up the papers. One area of great interest, I think, to Georgia is in many other countries that are developing is foreign aid. Is it good? Is it bad? Should we try to get more? Should we try to get less? My friend Bill Easterly at New York University is a very well-known economist, and you remember that guy Jeffrey Sachs? Hey, boy, Jeffrey Sachs and Bill Easterly hate each other. You should Google them, and you'll see these exchanges. These two people really hate each other. But Bill Easterly is a big critic of foreign aid. He is of the view, and the numbers he has and the data he shows using our index has shown that, in fact, especially after you control for economic freedom, countries that get more foreign aid grow slower after the foreign aid. So the next time President Obama comes, or President Bush, or whoever comes and says they want to give you money, you should just tell them, no, keep your money. Because if Georgia's like the rest of the world, countries that got the most aid grew the slowest, grew slower than the countries that got less aid. Right? Aid has not worked. This is no secret. Everybody that studied foreign aid knows this. All the scholars of foreign aid knows this. The only people that don't know this are the people who get rich off of foreign aid, like the IMF and the World Bank and politicians. They all think it works, but they're all getting rich off of it. Right? If you study the data, foreign aid doesn't work. It's bad, actually. It's not just that it doesn't work. It's actually bad for you. And that's, again, that's something that Bill Easterly talks about. He uses our index to help him answer that. Another interesting topic that has some relevance here is, what about war? Eric Gartsky is a professor of political science. He's not an economist. He's a political science professor at California, San Diego. And Eric studies whether countries go to war or not. And I think the little thing in August of '08, I think that was a war. The political scientists define war as any international conflict in which at least 1,000 people die. So I think 1,000 people died. So that was a war, okay? And so he studies all these wars all over the world. And then he looked at the Economic Freedom Index, and he found out that if you are in the top 10%, if you're up here in these Hong Kong, you can't read this, but it's Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, okay. If you're right up here in the top 10%, you have a 0.1% chance in the time period he studied. You have a 0.1% chance, 1 out of 20. No, 1 out, that's much less. Very low. Yeah, 1 out of, of going to war. If you are down here in the bottom 10%, you have a 7% chance. Okay? So it's a 14 times greater chance of having a war if you're down here than if you're up here. All right? And he wrote a paper called The Capitalist Peace. about how free market capitalism, as measured by the index, appears to be strongly related to fewer international conflicts. Now, there's no guarantee, of course, but it certainly is an interesting result. I must say that he was criticized by a lot of his political science friends because his political science friends always talk about how democracy is very important. And what Eric Garsky says is it's not really democracy that is so important, it's free market capitalism that's most important. He's not against democracy, but he says if you look at the data on war, the big difference is between free market capitalism and socialism, not democracy, non-democracy. And so a lot of political scientists got mad at him for that result. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Here's an interesting paper by two good liberal Americans in the, again, proper sense. Russell Sowell and Pete Leeson. Pete Leeson has a book on pirates. Have you seen the book on pirates? You should have him speak about piracy. Like literally pirates, like in the Pirates of the Caribbean kind of pirates. Anyway, they have a paper on what they call contagious capitalism. One of the things is, well, you know, what happens if a country like Georgia reforms? Does that spill over, or does it make it more likely that like Armenia will reform? You have what? How many neighbors? Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So you have four neighbors. And so what they were looking at is if one country changes its economic freedom, does that cause the other countries surrounding it to change? Or the reverse. What if the countries around you change? Does that influence you? And the answer is yes, but only a little bit, about 20%. Now this is somewhat relevant because a lot of U.S. foreign policy has been about trying to spread free market capitalism and democracy around the world. And the argument was, well, if we can fix Iraq, that'll spill over and help, you know, Iran or Saudi Arabia or Jordan or something. Okay? Well, they actually find a little bit of evidence for that, but not a lot. Okay? So it's just a scientific study, but it's kind of interesting to show you an example of the kind of work that's been done. Many people are interested in income equality or income inequality, or the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. If you look at the data with the Economic Freedom Index, it turns out that economic freedom, countries that are blue actually have more income equality rather than the countries that are red. That as you go up the scale, the general tendency is for there to be more equality in the society. That's exactly the opposite of what the socialists told us, right? The socialists tell us that we need socialism to keep the inequality in society low. It turns out that in the data, they're exactly wrong. Now, here's another little example of how you should arguing with people. When I talk to Americans who are American liberals, that is, say, American socialists, when they say, you know, we want to be more like Sweden, because Sweden is more socialist than America, a little bit. They're more socialist than America, and Sweden has very little income inequality. Everybody's kind of the same there. Not everybody, but you know, a lot of equality. And the United States is more capitalist, more free market. And we have a lot of inequality in the U.S. By the way, all that's true. It's all true. The U.S. has more inequality than Sweden. Sweden is more socialist than the United States. That's true. But exactly how many data points did I just use? 2, right? I picked 2 countries. And those 2 countries happen to fit in the argument for the leftist. The leftist says socialism makes more equality, capitalism makes more inequality. So they picked 2 countries where the argument fits. Wait, there's more than 2 countries in the world, people. There's 100 and some countries out there where we have data on this stuff. You're going to when you're arguing with someone, don't let them pick the only 2 countries that fit their case. Don't let them get away with that. Right? Go to the data. We have data on this stuff. It's not hard to get. You can download my index. You can download the income inequality data from the World Bank tomorrow morning in a half hour. In fact, if you use 100 countries, or all the countries in the world where we have data, they're wrong. In general, not all, not always. There's Sweden. In general, countries with more market capitalism are more equal than countries with more regulations and taxes and so forth. That's the fact. Okay. So this is Jerry Scully's study. I have a recent study I should probably put up there now. That's a little old, 2002. But I like that study, and Jerry's an old friend, and he just died. So I left it in there in honor of my friend Jerry. But, again, the point here is that data is our friend. If you want to make an argument with somebody, and there's data out there that can be used as evidence for that argument, use the data. And I got bad news for you. If the data say the opposite of what you think, you might be wrong. Right? I mean, it's possible that you're wrong. But here's the other thing. If you're sure you're right, if you're certain that you're correct, if you're certain whatever view you have of the world is correct, then you should not be afraid to go collect data. Because the data should tell you that you're right. Okay? Too many people who are arguing about liberalism, too many students of liberty, argue only about theory with the socialists. We should do more data. We have data now. We can fight the social. If you want to fight socialists, I see most people wearing these little pins, so maybe not everybody in the room is a liberal, but if you're a liberal and you want to fight socialists, you can certainly keep fighting them by talking about the theory of why markets work better and not, and so forth. But evidence is your friend. We have evidence on our side. We have a lot of evidence on our side. Use it. And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to use it, please. Now, this last one is not, I don't believe this, but my friend Marshall Stocker, he built a stock portfolio, and he says, and I don't believe him, but he says if you buy stocks based on the Economic Freedom Index, you'll make more money. Okay, he's a stockbroker. So, you don't believe those stockbrokers. They always tell you, if you follow my advice, you'll make more money. But there's at least one study out there that says if you buy countries with high economic freedom, actually with changing high, going up, if you buy those stocks, or in America you would buy, ETFs, exchange traded funds in those stocks, that you'll get an abnormally high rate of return. I think that's probably not an argument I would push too hard, and I certainly don't advise you to buy stocks on this basis. But anyway, there is some research on finance out there that looks at that. And that's really all I have as far as a main presentation. I hope that I've provoked a few questions, though, and we have time. I don't know. We have time for questions. And,
well, if you have questions, please.
I have a more specific question, actually. I can't see from here, but there are 4 charts at the bottom of the map. I'd just like to ask what those charts mean.
Yeah, thank you. No problem. Thank you. In the text, in the book, we produce these little bar charts, and they're very simple charts where the red countries are the bottom 25%, and then second 25%, and so forth. And so then this is GDP per capita. It's the average level of income. So the countries in blue have, on average, more income than the countries that are red. And it's about a 9-to-1 difference. And then this one is life expectancy. It's about 20 years greater if you're blue than red. This is happiness. These happiness surveys, you've heard of these. This is the World Values Survey's happiness measure. It's actually life satisfaction or something. And it's about 3 points higher. I don't know what 3 points happier means, though. I mean, I know what $30,000 is, but I don't know what 3 points happier it is. But they say you're on their scale. Again, I don't know what that means. But I mean, how happy are you? 47.3. I mean, I don't. What do you say? Anyway, that's that. But anyway, there's a well-known study out there on that. And then this is the Corruption Perceptions Index. It's pretty well known. It probably gets attention here. And the higher number means less corruption, so less corruption as you go. And there are a lot of charts like other graphs like this that are in the book that we have. And this is just a few of them we put on there. They're all very simple. They're not nearly as involved and sophisticated as like the growth study, but you know, that's what those are.
Thank you very much for coming to invite us. And I have a question. Now we're earthquake in Japan, and there is economical problem for over the world. And right now everybody is interested what will happen in Georgia in economic side and how things will go on. And it is my thing what about everybody, businessmen are worried about. And it's serious for us. So.
Okay. So your question's about the impact of Japan. Okay. I got to be a little bit honest. I've been in Georgia for a week doing very little but lecturing and eating hinkali and drinking natakatari. I have not followed as closely as most people who are living regular lives. But the short answer is we've had natural disasters of many, many different kinds of similar magnitude. And it's very bad for the countries that are directly involved. But the good news is, if there is such a thing, is that the global economy that we live in now is highly resilient to small, or to even big catastrophes in places. We had the earthquake in Japan a few years ago. We had the earthquakes in Chile and the tsunami in Indonesia, and these things are all devastating to the locals involved. But the integrated global economy is able to adjust very quickly. And if a product or part of the supply chain for a product is disrupted because of this, there's usually another substitute part of the supply chain you can tap into. So I would predict that it has almost no impact on Georgia, especially Georgia, because you're pretty far removed from Japan. But that's the larger lesson, though, is that globalization, being interconnected to the world markets, is one of the greatest insurance policies you can buy. Because if you are trying to go about your economic life just by yourself and just relying on your own resources and your own people, you're highly at risk to some kind of problem, like an earthquake or a war. If you're integrated with the global economy and there's a local problem, it's much, much easier to deal with that problem. And so globalization is like an insurance policy against catastrophes of different kinds. And I think what you'll see is the countries that are most globally integrated are the ones that handle these kinds of problems the best.
You mentioned about the foreign financial aid, and you said like negatively correlated to the economic growth. Maybe it's vice versa, like it depends, economic growth depends on financial aid, and vice versa, like financial aid depends on economic growth. The country which is growing slowly gets financial aid from the foreign countries. The dependent variable here, which one is a dependent variable? That's the question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and every statistical study, statistics only shows us correlation; it never shows us causation. And the worry of reverse causation is always a concern. There's no statistical way to be sure of what you're describing isn't the case. Although one of the things that Bill does in his work is he looks at sort of pre and post. Take a country that was growing at a certain rate before and then compare it after they start to get more foreign aid. And that holds constant a lot of things. And the tendency, again, what he shows is that the growth slows after you get the aid. And so there are some ways with data to try to figure out that. And none of those ways are perfect. And what you say could be true. I don't think it's probably true, but it could be true. And there's no way to be sure that what you're saying isn't actually what's going on. That's true of all things, and it's an excellent point. You always should be concerned. There are ways with statistics to try to figure out whether that's likely to be going on or not. And I think they've done that. And again, I don't think any of the foreign aid literature I've seen has concluded that the reverse causality is the driver. It's in fact what Bill says. But it's a point well taken indeed.
Yeah, good evening. I'm a graduate from the Free University, but from Brussels in Belgium. I'm also a consultant working for Deloitte, and I generally agree with your philosophy and the findings. However, the perfect model, or the model that includes all the growth theories, explains something like 55% or 60% of the variations that we observe in reality. Depending on the database that you use, sometimes you get a lower percentage. Your database is actually excellent, but there are others, like the World Economic Forum's database, the Heritage Foundation database, and they do not always work as well, which means actually that the way you construct your data has an impact on the results you get later. Also, if your model is able to explain 60%, it still means that there's 40% that remains unexplained, and may have to do with the quality of the data, but also with perhaps forgotten variables, including when you say that institutions matter. It means also, in my opinion, that it's not only important that you have institutions, but how they're working, including the institution of government, which has or does not have policies and a development agenda. It's not only a reform agenda that stimulates growth, but perhaps also a development agenda. Take the example of a country like Kosovo, which is a country that was that was liberalized by design, because it was stamped out of the ground 10 years ago, and a bunch of consultants have dumped a whole lot of liberal policies on the country. But still, after 10 years, you have a country without an economy. Examples like Korea, which do not follow a pure liberal economic model, and even China. And today, for example, I looked at data regarding the protection of intellectual property in United Arab Emirates. When you look at the data, the index in the World Economic Forum, the United Arab Emirates is ranked, it is scoring very good in terms of protection of intellectual property rights. And in reality, when you're doing business, you know, and especially in Georgia, that the Emirates are certainly not protecting intellectual property rights. Also, being an econometrician myself by education, I do recognize and I do admit that sometimes with the models that I'm working on, and I think it's not entirely different with other econometricians, we do massage data, and we do sometimes eliminate data that would contradict what we wish to demonstrate. So there is a certain degree of intellectual dishonesty. At least I admit it. There are a few more comments to make, but better stop up.
Well, I agree with everything you said. It's a matter of degree in many cases, though. And you said many things, so let me just sort of highlight one or two that I can quickly answer. It's true that no statistical model of economic growth approaches 100% predictive power. There's a lot of variation in growth rates across the world that are unexplained, either, as you say, because they're just unexplainable, or because there's a left out variable. The real challenge, though, is that we only have 100 or so countries with decent data, and there's more than 100 potential explanations out there, and we don't have enough degrees of freedom to address all of them. And so literally every scholar who wants to study growth is going to have to pick and choose from the available data and the theories out there which that he chooses to. And that's why I don't think you should trust my one study as gospel truth, because I might be a dishonest person. So if you really want to reach a conclusion from the empirical data, you need to read lots of literature, and what you find in some cases is that a particular result is in fact highly variable depending on whether person A did the study or person B did the study. But in other cases, what you find is it doesn't matter whether it was A or B that did the study, you get the same doggone result with different data and so forth. And that's, when you start to see patterns like that in the research, at some point I think it's okay to say it's probably there. If 25 people find the same result with different ways and different biases and different degrees of dishonesty, then it might actually be true. The thing about statistics is that numbers never tell us what's true. Only you can decide what's true. But I agree to a point, but I guess I'm a little bit less cynical about it than I think than you are. The quality of the data is a concern. I'm intimately familiar with the World Economic Forum's IP number. I used to use it, and now I don't, because I just didn't think it was believable. I don't have a way to prove to you or anybody else that we set out to put those numbers together so that they would work in a growth regression. But I can tell you, I put those numbers together. We started doing this project in 1989. We published our first edition in 1996. We were published. I probably never ran a growth regression until 2002 or 3. We put that in. I can only simply put my hand over the Bible and swear that when we put that together, the only thing that Jim Gortney and I were concerned about was economic freedom. Whether it correlated with growth or not was not, in fact, on our horizon. We didn't do any growth work until 10 years after we had started the project. Now, I can't prove that to you now. I can simply put my hand in the air and say, I promise that in my case, at least, that's the case. But it is true that, that's a concern. Whatever you said about the Heritage Foundation, if it was bad, I agree. I don't much like their work. So.
Can I innovate? I think that the Economic Freedom Index is also composite. It's not coming from one set of data, from inflation or trade barriers or something like that. So, of course, there is another study which you was also involved, and together with Jim Gortney and others, that one of the most important things for growth is the low taxes. And that's why, for example, the South Korea, which has many features of not very free economy, but having very low taxes for many years, they achieved that growth. And also, I think that there is, of course, it's very difficult to say there is no clear receipt for growth. Yeah, and if you look to different countries, you can find different features of different countries, and it's important to concentrate which are the important. Because if you look to fast-growing countries like Korea, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, China, yeah. If you look to these countries from different angles, you can find different things, yeah. Because you can collect the very strange collection of features which are successful for growth. You can say, okay, you need to have Communist Party like in China. You need to have most of the presidents to be crooks, corrupted like in South Korea, taking bribes. You need not to have any private ownership of the land like in Hong Kong. You need to be the Socialist Party in power, like in Taiwan or something like that, yeah, or like in Singapore. You can look from another angle and say, okay, one of them they have industrial policies. Singapore has the state-owned enterprises. Hong Kong they don't have statistical agency, etc., etc. But the important thing which is uniting all these countries are the low taxes, which is important, low inflation, which is important, because there is no case of high tax, high inflation country which can be successful. Yeah? So I think that, of course, there is no hidden 40% of answers. 60% is level of accuracy of measuring each of these parameters. Yeah? In investment in human capital, how can you measure it precisely what's the investment in human capital? Of course, it's based on some meta-statistics, which is based on statistics, which is of course wrong. Yeah? But in general, the answer is very clear. Moving on that direction means having more freedom, and having more freedom means having more growth in general. Of course, suddenly something can happen, like no one these type of measures will take disaster in Japan. Yeah? Of course, Japan can have next year negative growth, yeah? But that does not mean that it has that due to economic policy. It has it due to natural disaster. So there is a lot of that type of things which make this data more or less vague. But it does not mean that the general answer is different.
But the model actually does a pretty good job of predicting. There are obviously going to be, there'll be countries that does a bad job, but I think they might be the one that I would not have picked. But the point is, there's going to be countries where the model does a very bad job. There are always, in any study, there's going to be outliers above and below the predicted amounts. That's just that's true.
I got a question about political system in the country, and what do you think? Have you studied the correlation between democracy and economic freedom? Because in poor countries like Georgia, it's very difficult to have at the same time economic freedom and democracy, because people see the advantage of economic freedom later. It takes a little bit time. Yeah? So what can you say about this?
Yeah, well, I have studied it quite a bit, and the thing that stops me from studying more that it's a very complicated issue. The simple correlation is highly positive. If you look at the countries that score highly on the Economic Freedom Index, they also score highly on the various measures of political democracy, protection of freedom of speech, civil liberties, things of that sort. There's a gross correlation that's very strongly positive between the two. One of the little bar graphs we frequently put in the book is exactly on that relationship. There are numerous outliers, though. I mean, there are many, many cases where that general relationship clearly shows up bad, like Singapore. Singapore is second on our index, but it's not considered a very high-functioning liberal democracy by any means. You could also argue the case of India, not so much the India today, but the India of the 1970s, which was a very liberal liberal democracy, freedom of speech and voting and so forth, but the Indian economy was socialist. So what you find is points in time in different places, and sometimes in like Singapore's case, a long period of time where there's a disconnect between economic liberalism and political liberalism. But the gross correlation is strongly positive. Now, I'd like to be able to answer your question about sort of what comes first. Should you pursue economic freedom first or political freedom first, or what's the dynamic relationship between those? And I've got one paper published in a very good journal on this where I looked at some of these questions. The problem really fundamentally is we don't have a lot of data. There aren't that many countries that have reformed in both dimensions. We've got economic reformers, we've got a few political reformers, but there just isn't a lot. I'm a statistician at heart, right? I don't want to draw a conclusion from 8 data points. And frankly speaking, these questions of democracy and economic liberalism with the data we have, only about 20, 30 years worth of data, we don't have a richness of diversity for me to be really comfortable with any kind of conclusion. I do think that one problem area is the old India problem. If you try to have a liberal democracy with freedom of speech and civil liberties and socialism, that's, I think, a very hard combination to keep. Because socialism doesn't work. It results in low growth and low incomes, and in many cases poverty. It just doesn't work. And when you have a poor running economy and a democracy, people get mad. And they're mad because their economy's not doing well. And so they want to do something about it. And they're going to vote in somebody new. The somebody new might be a good guy, or it might be a bad guy. I don't know. But I do know that countries that try to have liberal democracy and socialism are going to find that to be a tough combination to make last. It's hard, in a democracy, it's hard to have a poor running economy. Just because people get mad, they're going to vote for change. Now, in Venezuela's case, they voted for worse change. So it could go bad, but at least there'll be change. The other case is, what about Singapore? A country that has high economic freedom but low political freedom? There, I really don't have any idea. That might last. I mean, it's lasting a long time in Singapore. And there's no real, as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of hints of people worried. I mean, they seem to be real happy with their, their Mercedes and their Provident Fund. Singapore is not a perfect economy, but it's highly market oriented, and it doesn't have a lot of political freedom. I don't sense that it's not obvious to me that can't go on a long time. It might not go on a long time, but it might go on a long time. I just don't know.
But does really you can say that Singapore does not have political freedoms? Because I think that it's a very wrong perception. Of course, they have the same party, which actually is the Socialist Party. They are member of Socialist International. They are ruling Singapore from 65. But they have perfect judiciary system till 1985 or 87. They were under the Supreme Court for Singapore was the British Supreme Court, the House of Lords, yeah, and they have elections, and the only issue is that no other party win that elections, yeah. So I'm not sure that's why. That same was happening in Japan for 60 years, yeah, till last elections when Naoto Kan was elected. The same was happening in Mexico for more than 8 years. Yeah, but nobody says that in Japan you don't have political democracy. You have political democracy, but the structure of Japanese economy, political class, and etc., was such that the election can be predicted easily. Yeah, so having vibrant political life does not mean that it's the only way having civil liberties. I think that there is no evidence or there is no civil liberties in Singapore. Yeah? Of course they have civil liberties, and that's the key.
Yeah, it's not as bad in Singapore as many people make it sound. The big problem is political speeches. Writing op-eds or books against the government is not going to get you far. It'll probably get you jailed if you're a citizen or expelled if you're not. But a lot of regular civil liberties are pretty well protected there. Same is true in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, under the British, had no functioning democracy, but they had a lot of civil liberties. I mean, you could do anything you wanted and say anything you wanted, and marry anyone, all the civil liberties, religion, and so forth. So it's not Myanmar or anything in Singapore. So.
Well, it's true that we might have different problems with rations. It might be measurement or omitted variable problems. But can we say that there are some factors that might not be in that unexplained 40%? For example, like government spending. Can government spending have some explanatory power for economic growth?
Well, government spending is one of the parts of the Economic Freedom Index, and one thing you could do as a next step in the research is to disaggregate, take the component parts of the Economic Freedom Index and, try to separate them, and that's been done. The work on size of government, I think you have to be, if you just look at it really simply, big government countries are actually growing quickly, but that's because they're all have good property rights. So if you're going to study the size of government and growth, you need to control for property rights, because the best places with biggest governments are, you know, Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark, and they have the best property rights and most, you know, the least corrupt judges and everything else. So you need to do a study to figure out the, you know, proper regression type study to work on that, and people do that. The evidence is a little bit mixed. In fact, it's a little bit mixed about any of the components. One of the things we've found in our work is that the sum works a little bit better than the parts. And that's because I think there's interaction in the parts. Some countries that they have high government spending, but they've got really good property rights. So the high government spending may be bad, but the property rights are good. Some countries have low government spending, but bad property rights. And so one of the things you really need to try to do is sort of balance all those things out. The index sort of does that automatically. And all we do is simple averages. We didn't weight anything, but it does that automatically. You can do that on your own, and people are doing that. But it's not yielding a lot of really clear results about which pieces matter the most or anything like that. But my own view is the negative spending. If you control for property rights, government spending is very much negatively correlated with growth. It's not if you don't control for property rights. You really need to compare like with like when you do that kind of study. Okay. One more.
Where does financial deregulation fit into the model in the indicator of economic freedom and the impact on economic growth?
Well, again, in terms of the growth study, we didn't do any component analysis. We didn't look at any pieces of it, so I wouldn't know. We don't have, one of the constraints with the Economic Freedom Index is I'm building an index for 141 countries. And all of the indicators that we use have to be sort of common policies that exist throughout the world. And financial regulation, I mean, certainly there's banks everywhere, but sort of, when you think about sophisticated financial regulation like we have in New York, or, the SEC, that's something that is simply not applicable. It doesn't just not exist. It would make no sense to do it for Sri Lanka, right, for example, to speak of. Now, there are a few financial variables in there that are very crude. One is when you look at the ease of foreigners opening up a bank account. One of the freedoms we look at is, can a foreigner open up not a bank account, but can they open a bank? Many countries proscribe the ability of foreigners to open banks within the country. My understanding is that foreigners in Georgia, a Swiss banker could open up a bank here. But in many countries that would not be the case. We also look at things like interest rate controls, so those sort of level of type things. But the sort of Basel capital controls, Glass-Steagall in the United States. Glass-Steagall is a great example. That's the separation of investment banking from commercial banking rule in the United States, which we got rid of in 96 or whatever, we got rid of that. That's a very highly U.S. specific regulation that, I just couldn't include it. I can only include variables that, like the minimum wage. Pretty much everybody has minimum wage of some kind or another, so we can include that. Everybody has taxes, so we can include that. A very country-specific rule or regulation is not the kind of thing we can include. And they can really matter, but it's the nature of the nature of this kind of project is you can only do the most sort of lowest common denominator type policies.
Financial markets liberalization has been applied in many countries, in different formats. And in many of these countries or regions, we have seen indeed financial crisis. The Asian.
Oh, come on, we had financial crisis for hundreds of years before we had regulations. We're having them since we had regulations. And I'm a historian I'm a financial historian of the United States economy. We had financial panics before we had any of this stuff. We had financial panics after we had this stuff. And I honestly don't see any correlation there at all. And we have as many as we can. And if I could get variables for more, I would certainly have them.
I think financial regulation is increasing size of crisis.
Well,
That's the outcome.
I would say there's been no
Bigger
relation.
and bigger.
So, are we?
So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. I want to, Bob is the only person who is making Kinkali in Alabama.
That's right.
Yeah. So, and he also, when he's coming in summertime, he's spending time in high mountains. In Kazbegi,
Kazbegi.
Kazbegi, etc. So he's big fan of Georgia. And thank you for that.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.